Jenna Ramirez stepped off the transport aircraft into the blistering heat of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The desert air hit her like a wall, dry, dusty, and tinged with the unmistakable scent of gunpowder and sweat. She blinked against the bright sunlight as she surveyed the forward operating base, FOBIB, before her. It was a sprawl of concrete barriers, sandbags, and metal shipping containers painted in faded tan, surrounded on all sides by barren hills and rocky outcrops. This was her home now, a place that both terrified and inspired her. The base was buzzing with activity, soldiers moving in tactical formations, vehicles rolling past with a growl, and the distant thud of helicopters coming and going. Jenna adjusted her load-bearing vest, feeling the weight of her medical kit press against her chest. She was a civilian contractor, but she carried herself with the precision of a soldier. For Jenna, this was more than just a job, it was a mission. She had been a medic in the Army for 8 years before an injury forced her out. Now, as a contractor, she returned to the front lines, supporting troops with the skills she had fought hard to keep. "Welcome back, Ramirez," called a familiar voice. It was Sergeant First Class Marcus Hayes, a grizzled infantryman with a scar running from his temple to his cheekbone. He'd been one of Jenna's closest friends during her time in the service. "Looks like the same dusty hellhole as always." Jenna forced a smile. Some things never change. They walked together toward the logistics tent where Jenna was assigned. It was the nerve center for supplies, everything from ammunition and food to medical gear and radios. Jenna's job was to manage the flow of resources, ensuring that soldiers out in the field had what they needed to survive. But logistics in a war zone was never straightforward. The roads were treacherous, convoys ambushed, and supplies often delayed or lost. As they passed the perimeter, Jenna noticed the tall watchtowers manned by alert Marines scanning the horizon. Every pair of eyes was trained for movement: enemy scouts, IEDs, anything out of place. The base was surrounded by hostile territory. Insurgent forces, primarily Taliban fighters, used the rugged landscape to their advantage. They knew every mountain path and hidden valley. They blended with the local population, striking when least expected. Inside the logistics tent, Jenna immediately went to work. The hum of radios, the rustle of maps, and the clatter of crates formed a chaotic symphony. She checked inventory lists, verified manifests, and coordinated with convoy commanders. Each shipment was a lifeline. A delay could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers on patrol. Yet, amid the routine, Jenna felt a gnawing unease. Intelligence reports had indicated an uptick in Taliban activity nearby. The local informants, often unreliable, had warned of a possible attack. Jenna had learned to trust her gut in moments like these. Something was coming. That night, Jenna sat alone in her tent, the harsh glow of a lantern casting shadows on the canvas walls. Outside, the base was quieter, but tension crackled in the air like static electricity. She reviewed the latest communications intercepts on her laptop, trying to piece together the enemy's movements. The voices on the radio whispered in Pashto words she didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably urgent. Her mind drifted back to the reasons she had come here. Jenna had seen too many friends fall, too many lives shattered by war. Leaving the Army had been one of the hardest decisions of her life, but her sense of duty never faded. She had trained to save lives, and even now, as a contractor, she was determined to do just that. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the tent flap. It was Corporal Liam O'Connor, a young communications specialist with a nervous smile. "Got word from the intel team," he whispered. "Something stirring in the valley near the Kachaki Dam. Taliban fighters, maybe a squad or two. Could be gearing up for something big." Jenna's stomach tightened. "Any idea when?" "Soon. Could be within hours." The base command was already on high alert, but Jenna knew the soldiers were exhausted. Weeks of patrols and firefights had taken their toll. She pushed her doubts aside, focusing instead on the task ahead. That night, Jenna couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, listening to the hum of the generators and the occasional crackle of distant gunfire. Every shadow seemed alive. She thought about the families waiting back home, the friends she'd lost, and the fragile thread that kept everyone here alive. As dawn broke, the base came to life again. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, weapons checked and rechecked. Jenna joined the morning briefing, where the commanding officer detailed the latest intel. The insurgents were clever, ruthless, and patient. The enemy wasn't just waiting for an opportunity, they were creating one. Jenna steeled herself. Whatever was coming, she would face it head on. The soldiers depended on her, and she would not let them down. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. The war in Helmand was far from over, but Jenna Ramirez was ready to meet it, one heartbeat at a time. The night was a restless one at the forward operating base. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights inside the logistics tent mixed with the low murmur of soldiers on patrol, the occasional metallic clink of gear, and the distant hum of the perimeter generators. Jenna Ramirez sat hunched over her radio intercept station, fingers poised over the controls, her eyes scanning the glowing screen. The voices crackling through the static were foreign, fragmented, spoken in hushed tones of Pashto, an indecipherable puzzle she'd learned to interpret by the rhythm, urgency, and tone. Something wasn't right. She had been following the chatter all evening, trying to catch a thread of useful information. The voices whispered about movement, about the men in green, code for coalition forces. And there were references to a new plan. A shadow of a warning passed through the frequency, the kind that made Jenna's heart quicken. Across the tent, Corporal Liam O'Connor was seated by a wall-mounted radio, his brows furrowed. He glanced at Jenna, sharing a silent understanding. Neither had to say it aloud. The enemy was plotting, and the base was their target. Jenna leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. These nights were the hardest, the quiet before the storm, the waiting that stretched endlessly. She thought back to her training, the countless hours spent interpreting similar signals, each one potentially a lifeline. But this was different. The urgency here felt personal, like a predator circling a wounded prey. Outside, the base was unusually still. The sentries patrolled with heightened vigilance, but there was a strange absence of the usual chatter on the radios. The local interpreter Farid, who normally hovered near the command post, was nowhere to be seen. Jenna had noticed his silence earlier, an ominous sign. Farid was a man of contradictions, loyal but cautious, a bridge between two worlds fraught with suspicion. His sudden quiet gnawed at her instincts. The radio crackled again. This time, Jenna caught a phrase repeated in rapid succession. Shomo. North. She pulled up a map, tracing the terrain with her finger. North of the base lay the Kajaki Dam, a strategic choke point and frequent hotspot for insurgent activity. If the Taliban were moving there, it could mean one thing: a push toward the base. She stood and walked over to Sergeant Hayes, who was overseeing the supply manifests. Marcus, she said quietly, I'm picking up chatter about movement near Kajaki. Something big. He frowned. We've had patrols in the area all week. Nothing concrete yet. Tonight feels different. The local interpreter's gone quiet, and the radio signals are picking up something urgent. Marcus nodded slowly. I trust your gut, Jenna. Let me inform command. Jenna returned to her station, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The base was no stranger to attacks, but what worried her most was the sense that this time, the enemy wasn't just attacking, they were trying to break them from within. Her thoughts drifted to the soldiers she supported, the young men and women far from home, relying on her to keep their supplies steady, their medical kits stocked, their radios alive. They were vulnerable. They needed every advantage she could help provide. Later that evening, Jenna made her way to the command tent, the weight of the night settling on her shoulders. The briefing room was tense. Maps littered the tables, with colored pins marking known insurgent positions. Commanders and intelligence officers spoke in low tones, planning contingencies. The commanding officer, Colonel Daniels, looked up as Jenna entered. "Ramirez, you have something?" She nodded. "We're picking up increased Taliban chatter. Movement near Kajaki. Plus, our interpreter is unaccounted for." Daniel's expression darkened. "We can't afford to be caught off guard. I'm authorizing increased patrols and perimeter checks." Jenna caught a glimpse of his worry. It mirrored her own. The base had weathered many storms, but this one felt different. It was more than just a fight for territory. It was a test of resolve. As the briefing ended, Jenna lingered by the map, tracing the winding mountain roads and rugged valleys. She thought about the enemy's perspective, how they used the terrain, the local population, their knowledge of every hidden path. They had patience and cunning. The war was fought not just with weapons, but with whispers, deception, and fear. Outside, a cool desert wind swept through the camp, scattering dust across the sandbags. Jenna pulled her jacket tighter and glanced toward the horizon, where darkness pooled like ink behind the distant hills. Back at her tent, she double-checked her medical supplies, ensuring everything was ready for what might come. Bandages, morphine, antibiotics, each item a small but vital promise to those she cared about. Just as she settled in, a sudden noise made her freeze, a faint shuffling at the edge of the camp. She grabbed her flashlight and pistol, moving cautiously toward the sound. But it was only Corporal O'Connor, returning from a late patrol. "False alarm," he whispered, catching his breath. "But the men out there, they're restless." Jenna nodded. "They know something we don't." The hours dragged on, punctuated by distant gunfire and the occasional burst of static on the radio. Jenna lay awake, muscles tense, senses alert. Then came the whispering. In the stillness of the early morning, Jenna heard low voices carried on the wind pashto words, spoken close enough to be heard, but too distant to understand. It was a chilling reminder that the enemy was watching, waiting. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. When dawn finally broke, the base stirred with quiet urgency. Patrols prepared for departure. Weapons checked and rechecked. Jenna moved among them, offering steady hands and calm words. The storm was coming, and every soul on the base would need all their courage. Jenna glanced once more toward the hills, where shadows shifted in the light. The enemy was out there, unseen but unmistakably close. And she would be ready. The early morning air was deceptively calm at the forward operating base nestled deep in Helmand Province. Jenna Ramirez, despite the nagging pain in her side from a previous injury, was meticulously going through supply manifests inside the logistics tent. The routine of inventorying medical kits, food supplies, and ammunition was her anchor, a semblance of order in the chaos that defined this distant war zone. Then, without warning, the night's fragile silence shattered. The first sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the compound, jagged and sudden. It wasn't far away. It was inside the base. Jenna's heart jumped to her throat. She dropped her clipboard and instinctively ducked behind a stack of crates, fingers tightening around her pistol holster. Enemy breach. East perimeter. Someone shouted, the panic unmistakable. Outside the tent, the world exploded into movement. Soldiers poured from their tents and bunkers, rifles raised, eyes wide with adrenaline-fueled alertness. Jenna's blood ran cold as she spotted figures slipping through a tier in the eastern fence insurgents. Many disguised in Afghan National Army uniforms, moving with terrifying precision. This wasn't a typical raid. It was an infiltration of wolf sneaking into the fold. Bullets tore through the air like angry hornets, pinging off metal crates and sandbags. Explosions rattled the ground as the attackers set off improvised charges, demolishing parts of the perimeter and throwing clouds of dust and debris into the morning sky. Jenna pressed herself flat, a searing pain flaring at her side where shrapnel had grazed her moments earlier. She bit back a cry, swallowing hard against the shock. Her training kicked in like a second heartbeat. She wasn't just a supply clerk. She was a lifeline for countless soldiers, depending on her calm in the storm. Nearby, a young soldier stumbled into her line of Sight Private Lillian Grant, clutching her arm, blood seeping between trembling fingers. Jenna crawled over, ignoring the stabbing pain, and tore a strip from her shirt to fashion a makeshift bandage. "Stay with me, Lillian," Jenna urged, voice steady despite the chaos. "Help is coming." Lillian's eyes were wide with terror. "They took Captain Farid. And others. They're lining them up. I heard them talking. They're going to execute them." Farid, the local interpreter who had gone. Missing the night before, was a man who'd walked the razor's edge between loyalty to coalition forces and survival in a land rife with suspicion and danger. Jenna felt a cold wash of dread. Public executions were not uncommon tactics by the Taliban, merciless warning to anyone who dared to collaborate with foreign troops. The firefight raged around them. Soldiers fought fiercely to repel the invaders, who moved like shadows through the compound, ruthless and well-coordinated. Jenna's eyes locked on the courtyard ahead. Through the haze of smoke, she saw prisoners, fellow soldiers, and Afghan allies forced to kneel against the concrete wall, rifles leveled at their backs. Her breath caught. She had to act. Pain radiating from her side, Jenna crawled toward her tent and retrieved her pistol. Though she was not trained as a frontline fighter, the weapon was a last resort she now desperately needed. The insurgents were frantic, shouting in Pashto, their voices tense. Jenna caught a chilling phrase. "Who's firing? Where is she?" Her blood ran cold. They were searching for the one who had been interfering, the unknown mark who had disrupted their plans before. Jenna steadied her trembling hand, took a deep breath, and fired. Her bullet struck true, hitting an insurgent in the leg. The man screamed in agony and collapsed, throwing the others into chaos. The breach that had seemed unstoppable faltered. Marines and soldiers rallied, pressing their counterattack with renewed vigor. Gunfire erupted in a savage crescendo as defenders pushed the attackers back. The courtyard became a chaotic battleground, smoke thick in the air, shouts and curses mingling with the relentless rattle of automatic weapons. Despite the searing pain, Jenna forced herself to move toward the wounded and prisoners. She found Lillian again, helping the young soldier to her feet as medics rushed past, bandaging and triaging. Sergeant Marcus Hayes appeared beside her, eyes scanning the scene. "We're holding the line," he said grimly. "But it's not over." Jenna nodded, swallowing bile. The attack was only the beginning. The firefight stretched on for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher, casting a harsh glare over the ravaged base. Reinforcements finally arrived, helicopters landing with the roar of rotors, offloading additional troops and medical supplies. Inside the aid station, Jenna was tended to. The shrapnel wound was painful, but not fatal. She kept her eyes open, absorbing the scenes around her wounded soldiers moaning softly, medics working frantically, commanders discussing next steps. Private Lillian, wrapped in a blanket and resting, gave Jenna a weak smile. "You saved my life," she whispered. Jenna shook her head, exhausted. "We saved each other." But beneath the surface of relief was a deep, gnawing fear. The enemy had struck from within, exploiting weakness and sowing terror. Farid and others were still missing hostages to an unknown fate. That night, as Jenna lay on a cot, pain dulling her senses, she replayed the day's events over and over. The whispered voices on the radio, the smell of burning supplies, the look in the prisoners' eyes as they faced death. The enemy's message was clear. No one was safe. The war was a brutal game of shadows and whispers, where trust was fragile and danger lurked everywhere. For Jenna Ramirez, the breach had changed everything. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about resistance, defiance, and hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. As dawn approached again, Jenna made a silent vow. She would not let fear win. She would stand wounded, but unbroken, ready to fight for every life, every hope, every dream tethered to that faraway base. Because sometimes, the smallest actions, the single shot in the darkness, were the sparks that ignited the fiercest fires of courage. And Jenna Ramirez was ready to be that spark. The days following the breach were a haze of pain, exhaustion, and relentless activity. Jenna Ramirez lay in the base's small medical ward, her side still throbbing from the shrapnel wound. The quiet hum of the ventilator and the occasional murmur of voices outside were a stark contrast to the violent chaos she'd survived. But Jenna's mind was anything but quiet. Every night, as the base settled into an uneasy calm, she replayed the moments of the attack over and over. The faces of the insurgents, the terrified prisoners, the whispered voices hunting for her, and most of all Farid. The interpreter had vanished the night before the assault, and now the rumors swirled like desert dust. Some said he had been captured. Others whispered darker tales, that he might have betrayed the coalition or been coerced into betrayal. Jenna refused to believe it. She remembered the fear and desperation in his eyes when she saw him dragged past during the fight, the look of a man caught between loyalty and survival. There had to be more to the story. As her wound slowly healed, Jenna grew restless. The base was on high alert, but the silence was suffocating. Soldiers sharpened their weapons, patrolled with grim determination, and shared whispered fears of a second attack. Jenna needed answers. More than that, she needed to act. Summoning her strength, she requested a meeting with Captain Marcus Hayes, the man who had led the defense during the breach. Marcus was a seasoned Marine, known for his calm under fire and his strategic mind. When Jenna approached him in the command tent, he looked up, eyes shadowed but alert. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Ramirez," he said, a hint of concern in his voice. "I'm fine," Jenna replied, forcing a smile. "But we can't just sit here, waiting for the next attack. We need to find out what happened to Farid, and who else might still be out there." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. We can't afford to lose anyone else. I'm organizing a small recon team to search nearby villages and gather intel." "You're coming." Jenna's heart surged. Despite her wound, she was ready. She had to be. That evening, Jenna joined the team, a mix of Marines and Afghan National Army soldiers. They moved out under cover of darkness, slipping quietly through the rugged terrain. The desert night was cold and unforgiving, stars blinking coldly overhead. The mission was simple: find Farid and any other captives before the insurgents could use them for propaganda or worse. Hours passed with only the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional whispered command. Jenna's mind raced with every step. What if they were too late? At a small village near the base, the team stopped. Marcus signaled for silence as they approached a cluster of mud brick houses. From the shadows, a faint flicker of light leaked through a crack in one of the walls. Jenna's pulse quickened. They moved closer, weapons ready. Suddenly, a child's cry shattered the night, and an elderly man appeared at the doorway, hands raised in surrender. "We mean no harm," Marcus called out, voice calm but firm. "We're looking for prisoners, people taken by insurgents." The man nodded slowly, eyes wary but resigned. "They came days ago," he said in broken English. "Took many. Some were hurt, others gone." Jenna's throat tightened. The villagers had been caught in the crossfire, trapped under the shadow of terror. The search continued, and at the edge of the village, they found a small, hidden compound. Guards paced the perimeter, weapons slung loosely but eyes sharp. Marcus gestured for the team to spread out. Jenna's heart pounded as she crept closer to the fence, peering through the gaps. Inside, she saw figures, men and women bound and guarded. Among them, to her shock, was Farid. His face was pale but alive, eyes flickering with a mixture of relief and fear as he caught sight of her. Jenna's breath caught. They had found him. Suddenly, alarms blared, and spotlights swung toward the fence. The guards had spotted them. "Contact!" Marcus shouted. The team opened fire, bullets ripping through the air. The fight was sudden and fierce. Jenna's world narrowed to adrenaline and survival. She fired her pistol, covering Marcus as he moved to breach the gate. They were outnumbered, but their determination was fierce. The compound's fence buckled under Marcus's blow, and the team surged inside. Jenna rushed to Farid's side, cutting the ropes binding his wrists. "Jenna?" he whispered, voice hoarse. She nodded. "We're getting you out." But the victory was short-lived. A powerful explosion rocked the compound, sending debris and dust into the air. Jenna was thrown backward, pain exploding in her side once more. Through the haze, she saw Marcus struggling to his feet, rallying the team to retreat. "Fall back," he commanded. They fled into the night, carrying Farid and the other captives with them. Back at the base, Jenna lay on a cot once again, the adrenaline fading and exhaustion setting in. Farid was safe, but the enemy's reach was deeper than they had imagined. Over the next days, Jenna and Marcus pieced together the grim truth. The breach had been orchestrated by an insider, a traitor, embedded within their own ranks, feeding information to the insurgents. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound. Jenna's resolve hardened. The fight was no longer just against a distant enemy. It was against shadows within their own midst. As the base braced for what was to come, Jenna looked out over the desert horizon. The war was changing, and so was she. No matter the cost, she would uncover the truth. And she would stop those who whispered in the dark. The tension in the base was palpable. The breach and the narrow rescue mission had left everyone on edge, eyes darting, voices hushed behind closed doors. Trust had become a fragile commodity, one that could shatter with the slightest tremor. For Jenna Ramirez, the wounds in her side had mostly healed, but the invisible wounds, the ones carved by suspicion and fear, were far deeper. The discovery of an insider's betrayal had shattered the fragile sense of security. The enemy was no longer just an external force, but a shadow lurking within their own ranks. Each glance, each whispered conversation felt loaded with danger. Captain Marcus Hayes called an emergency meeting in the command tent. The small group of officers and senior NCOs gathered around the makeshift table, faces grim under the harsh fluorescent lights. "We've confirmed it," Marcus said. "There's a leak. Someone has been feeding intel to the insurgents, everything from patrol schedules to supply movements." Jenna clenched her fists, fury and betrayal burning in her chest. She thought of Farid, caught in the enemy's web because of this treachery. "How are we going to find them?" she asked quietly. "They could be anyone." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "That's the problem. We don't know. But we have some leads: unexplained communications, odd movements, things that don't add up." Over the next days, Jenna joined the investigation. She pored over communications logs, intercepted messages, and interrogated soldiers who had acted suspiciously during the breach. It was a painstaking, soul-crushing process. The line between friend and foe blurred with each passing hour. Even the most trusted comrades were not above suspicion. One name kept coming up: Sergeant Dylan Price. Price was a seasoned veteran, a man respected by many for his combat skills and leadership. But in the shadows, whispers swirled about his late-night meetings with unknown contacts and unexplained absences. Jenna and Marcus confronted Price privately. "Sergeant, we need to talk about your whereabouts during the breach," Marcus began. Price's jaw tightened. "I was on patrol, like everyone else. I did my job." But the evidence told a different story. Phone records showed encrypted messages sent from Price's radio frequencies to unknown locations. He had been communicating with the enemy. The betrayal cut like a knife. Price's denial crumbled under the pressure of mounting proof. Eventually, he confessed not to being a full collaborator, but to passing information under duress. His family had been threatened, and he had been trying to protect them. The confession was a bitter pill. It was a reminder of the impossible choices faced in this war-zone: loyalties, torn apart by fear and survival. Price was detained, but the damage was done. The enemy had exploited his weakness to strike at the heart of the base. Jenna felt a mix of sorrow and anger. She understood the complexity of the situation, but couldn't forgive the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Farid's condition was improving. The interpreter, though weak, had been a vital source of information about the enemy's plans and movements. He revealed that the insurgents were preparing for a larger assault, one that could overwhelm the base if they weren't ready. The revelation set a new urgency into motion. The base prepared for a siege, fortifying defenses, rationing supplies, and readying every available soldier. Jenna, though still recovering, volunteered to assist with logistics and communications. Her knowledge of the base's layout and supply chains was invaluable. The nights were restless, punctuated by distant explosions and the ever-present threat of attack. One evening, as Jenna worked late in the communications tent, a message crackled over the radio, an encrypted transmission intercepted by Farid. "It's from the insurgent commander," Jenna said, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "They're planning to attack at dawn. Heavy weapons, mortar. They want to break us before reinforcements arrive." Marcus entered the tent, eyes dark with worry. "We need to prepare every man, every weapon." The hours until dawn were a blur of preparation. Soldiers checked their gear, commanders reviewed defensive positions, and medics braced for the inevitable casualties. Jenna stood beside Marcus as the sun's first light crept over the horizon, casting long shadows over the hardened faces of the defenders. "Whatever happens today," Marcus said quietly, "we hold the line." Jenna nodded, gripping her pistol tightly. The breach had been a brutal lesson, one she would never forget. As the enemy's engines roared in the distance, and the first mortar whistled through the sky, Jenna steeled herself for the fight of her life. Because in this war of shadows and betrayal, survival meant standing strong, not just against the enemy outside, but the demons within. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a pale light across the rugged terrain surrounding the base. Jenna Ramirez stood alongside Captain Marcus Hayes on the makeshift observation post, their eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the insurgents gathered. Dust clouds marked the slow but steady advance of enemy vehicles, jeeps mounted with heavy machine guns, pickup trucks carrying mortar teams, and groups of fighters swarming forward. The air buzzed with the tense anticipation of a storm. The breach had been a brutal wake-up call, but this was the true test. The insurgents were launching a full-scale siege. Inside the base, every soldier was alert and ready. Defensive positions had been fortified overnight. Sandbags were stacked high, trenches deepened, and makeshift bunkers reinforced with anything that could stop a bullet or absorb a blast. Medics readied their stations, nurses prepped surgical supplies, and communications teams manned the radios, ready to call for reinforcements or coordinate air support. Jenna, still sore from her previous wound but resolute, had been assigned to the command tent as a communications liaison. Her calm, steady voice would relay orders, coordinate supply drops, and keep the scattered units connected. But as the first mortar rounds began to rain down on the outer fences, the true scale of the assault became terrifyingly clear. Explosions rocked the base, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. Metal structures twisted and groaned under the impact. Soldiers scrambled to cover, the sharp whistle of incoming fire punctuating the chaos. Jenna's heart hammered as she relayed messages, her fingers flying over the radio keys. Medic teams to North Perimeter. We have multiple casualties. The enemy was relentless, hammering the base with mortar and rocket-propelled grenades, trying to weaken defenses before sending in ground forces. Marcus paced the command tent, barking orders with a sharp authority that steadied even the most shaken soldiers. Hold the line. Don't let them breach the wire again. Outside, the fighting was brutal and close. Jenna caught glimpses of the firefight through broken windows. Marines locked in deadly combat with insurgents, trying to force their way through barricades. One blast sent a nearby wall crumbling, showering Jenna with dust and small fragments. She coughed but stayed at her post, determination stealing her nerves. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. We've got wounded at the south gate. Need immediate evac. Jenna relayed the message instantly, coordinating with the medevac teams to dispatch helicopters through the thick smoke and enemy fire. Hours passed like minutes and centuries all at once. The sun climbed higher, relentless in its heat, but no one had the luxury to notice. Inside the command tent, Jenna's eyes burned from fatigue, but she refused to leave her station. Every call, every message could mean the difference between life and death. At one point, she received a distressing transmission from Private Lillian Grant, the soldier she had saved during the breach. Lillian's voice was strained but defiant. Jenna, we're pinned down near the eastern wall. Ammo's low, and we've got wounded. Jenna's stomach clenched. Hold tight, Lillian. Reinforcements are on the way. Stay calm. The base's defenders fought with everything they had, buying time until help arrived. But as afternoon waned into evening, the insurgents intensified their assault. Explosions grew closer, and the base's perimeter began to buckle under the constant pressure. Jenna felt the weight of exhaustion creeping into her limbs, but she pushed it aside. This was no longer just a battle of firepower. It was a test of will. Hours later, Marcus appeared at her side, grim-faced. We're holding, but just barely. We can't keep this up forever. Jenna nodded, swallowing back the rising fear. What about air support? The drones? Marcus shook his head. Heavy cloud cover. Our overhead assets are limited. The siege was tightening. That night, the base was a grim tableau of survival. Fires smoldered in the distance. The cries of the wounded echoed through the air. Yet amidst the destruction, acts of bravery flickered like stars in the dark. Jenna worked alongside the medics, handing out supplies, comforting the frightened, and relaying critical updates. She found Marcus in the makeshift command center, studying a map of the base. We can't hold the south gate much longer, he muttered. If they break through there, it's over. Jenna's jaw set. Then we'll make our stand there. No one's leaving that gate. As dawn broke on the second day of the siege, a lull descended over the battlefield, a quiet before the inevitable storm. Jenna took a moment to catch her breath, looking around at the battered but unbroken faces of her comrades. The siege was far from over, but in that moment, amidst the ruins and pain, hope flickered, a fierce, unyielding flame. They would fight. They would survive. And they would not surrender. The siege had dragged into its third day. The relentless pounding of mortar and gunfire had carved deep scars into the base's defenses. But the spirit of those inside refused to break. Exhaustion gnawed at their bones, yet every man and woman held their ground like a living wall against the storm. Jenna Ramirez was no exception. Though the pain from her old injury flared fiercely under the unforgiving sun, she refused to slow. Her role in communications had shifted into a command center rally point, organizing medevac, coordinating resupply, and directing the defense wherever needed. But it was far from enough. The insurgents' main assault was fixated on the southern gate, the weak point in the base's defenses. Marcus Hayes had assigned his best men to hold it, but the enemy pressed with a desperate, brutal intensity. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic scent of blood. It was here, amid the swirling chaos, that a figure emerged, Michael "Mick" Donovan, a contractor embedded with the coalition forces. Mick was not a soldier by training, but had a reputation for quick thinking and unyielding courage. His job had been logistical support, ensuring supplies made it to the front lines, but today he was a lifeline. Mick had been wounded earlier in the siege, a shrapnel wound in his leg that slowed his movements but did not dull his determination. He refused to be evacuated, insisting on staying to help wherever he was needed. As the enemy's pressure mounted at the south gate, Mick positioned himself near the barricades, armed with an M4 rifle and a grit that defied his contractor status. The insurgents came like a tide wave after wave, crashing against the defenders. Gunfire rang out, bullets tore through the air, and explosions shredded the earth. Amidst the hail of bullets, Mick took aim and fired, every shot calculated, every movement deliberate despite his injury. "Who's firing? Where is she?" A voice hissed from the enemy lines, fragmented but desperate. The insurgents were hunting. Someone was disrupting their plans, someone whose presence unsettled them. Mick realized the voice was not just searching for any target, it was hunting Jenna Ramirez. She had been the unseen thorn in their side, the spark of resistance that had turned their carefully orchestrated breach into chaos. In that moment, Mick understood that the wounded contractor was the last line between execution and survival, not just for Jenna, but for the entire base. The firefight intensified. Jenna, coordinating from the command tent, heard the frantic radio call, "Contact at South Gate." "Mick's down." Her heart stopped. Without hesitation, she grabbed her pistol and sprinted toward the southern wall, ignoring the searing pain in her side. The scene she reached was brutal, a chaotic mix of smoke, shouting, and gunfire. Mick lay on the ground, blood seeping from his leg, eyes sharp despite the injury. "Hang on, Mick," Jenna shouted as she crouched beside him. "Don't leave me," he gasped, wincing but steadying his aim. "Keep firing. They're close." The enemy was closing in. Jenna took the rifle Mick handed her and fired into the advancing insurgents. Her shots were precise, despite her inexperience, a testament to adrenaline and necessity. "Who's firing? Where is she?" The voice repeated. Closer this time, rage and fear mingled. Jenna's pulse hammered in her ears as she realized the enemy's desperation. Their plans hinged on silencing her. She moved to cover, dragging Mick with her as explosions erupted nearby. But their position was quickly becoming untenable. Marcus arrived with reinforcements, pushing back the enemy's advance with brutal efficiency. The tide began to turn, but Mick's condition worsened. Jenna refused to abandon him. She applied a tourniquet, trying to staunch the bleeding, her hands trembling but determined. "Stay with me, Mick," she urged. "You're not leaving." He managed a grim smile. "You're tougher than you look, Ramirez." Their bond, forged in the crucible of battle, was unspoken but real, a testament to the resilience of those thrown into war's darkest moments. As the insurgents retreated, forced back by the combined defense, Jenna helped Mick to his feet. "Medics are on their way," Marcus said, clapping Mick on the shoulder. "We'll get you patched up." Jenna watched as Mick was carried off, pain etched into every line of his face, but pride shining in his eyes. The battle was far from over, but the stand at the southern gate had bought precious time. The insurgents had been stopped, if only for now. Back in the command tent, Jenna sat for a moment, her body aching, her spirit weary but unbroken. She thought of Mick, the wounded contractor, who had become an unexpected hero. She thought of the prisoners lined up during the breach, the whispered threats, the voices hunting her in the dark. And she thought of the enemy's words, the desperate cry, "Who's firing? Where is she?" Jenna knew the answer. It was her voice, the voice of resistance, defiance, and hope. And as long as she could stand, as long as she could fight, she would be that voice. Because sometimes, the smallest spark, the shot fired by a wounded contractor holding the line, was enough to change the course of a battle. And sometimes, it was enough to save a life. The night was thick with smoke and tension, the base scarred from relentless mortar strikes and the staccato of gunfire. Jenna Ramirez sat quietly in the command tent, exhausted but alert, listening intently to the crackling radio transmissions. The siege had dragged on, and the insurgents were growing increasingly desperate. Their attacks were no longer just blunt force. They were precise, searching, almost personal. The whispered question haunted every report, every intercepted transmission. Who's firing? Where is she? It was clear to Jenna that the insurgents were hunting her, not just as an enemy soldier or a threat, but as a symbol of resistance. She had become the face of defiance in their eyes. But Jenna was far from alone. Wounded but unyielding, Mick Donovan, the contractor who had saved her life, was still here, helping to hold the line. The night deepened. Outside the command tent, shadows moved like specters, and the occasional flare lit the battlefield in ghostly bursts of light. Suddenly, an urgent call came through the radio. Enemy forces approaching the east perimeter. Heavy fire call for backup. Jenna sprang into action, relaying the message as Marcus Hayes organized a rapid response. As reinforcements raced toward the threat, Jenna noticed Mick struggling to stand, his injury slowing him. Without hesitation, she moved to support him. "You don't have to do this," she urged, voice steady but filled with concern. Mick shook his head, eyes burning with determination. "Not until this fight's over." Together, they made their way toward the eastern wall, where the enemy was pushing hard. The assault was brutal and chaotic. Explosions rocked the ground, bullets ripped through the air, and the cries of wounded soldiers filled the night. Jenna and Mick took cover behind a battered sandbag wall. The enemy fighters were closing in, their movements desperate but coordinated. Then, from the shadows, came a sudden burst of gunfire. Jenna fired back instinctively, the weapon steady in her hands despite the pain in her side and Mick's injured leg. One insurgent shouted, "Who's firing? Where is she?" The voice was frantic, trembling with a mix of fear and rage. Jenna's heart pounded. They were closing in, but the enemy had not found her yet. Mick raised his voice, shouting orders to the nearby defenders, buying Jenna crucial seconds to reposition. "Keep them off the wall. Don't let them through." The fight surged forward in a violent wave. Jenna's mind raced. This was no longer just a battle of bullets. It was a fight for survival and identity. She was the defender, the spark they feared. And now, the wounded contractor beside her was their shield. Amid the fury, Jenna spotted a young insurgent attempting to flank their position. With a sharp breath, she fired a precise shot that brought him down. Mick, despite the blood soaking his clothes, fought fiercely, his presence a stabilizing force among the defenders. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The enemy's assault slowed, faltered, and finally began to retreat, broken by the tenacity of those they had sought to destroy. As silence fell, Jenna and Mick looked at each other, breathing heavy, bodies aching, but hearts unbowed. Marcus arrived, his face lined with exhaustion, but glowing with pride. "You both saved this place tonight." Jenna shook her head, managing a tired smile. "We all did, together." Days later, as the siege lifted and reinforcements finally arrived, the base began to recover. Wounded soldiers were evacuated, supplies replenished, and the wounded contractor Mick was given medical care and honored for his courage. Jenna stood on the perimeter, watching the desert sun rise over the horizon, casting golden light across the scarred earth. The enemy had whispered in the dark, searching for the one who fired back, the woman who would not be silenced. But the truth was clear. The fight had been won because a wounded contractor refused to quit, because a soldier refused to back down, and because together they stood unbreakable. And the story of that night, the stand at the southern gate, the whispered question in the enemy's voice, and the courage that halted the execution, would live on. A testament to the strength found in unlikely heroes. Because sometimes it's not the rank or the uniform, but the heart and resolve of those who fight that makes all the difference. Enemy whispered, "Who's firing? Where is she?" Until a wounded contractor halted the execution. The dust had settled from the last barrage, but inside forward operating base Andrus, silence wasn't peace. It was pressure, the taut stillness before another storm. And Jenna Ramirez knew it. She sat hunched over a flickering console in the command tent, her uniform stained with dried blood and sand, her side throbbing beneath layers of gauze and grit. The siege hadn't broken them. Not yet. But the enemy wasn't finished. The most chilling part wasn't the explosions or the relentless gunfire. It was the voice they kept hearing over-intercepted. Radio chatter, raspy, confident, unsettling. Where is she? The woman, the one who fires. Find her. Bring her, or bleed. They weren't hunting the base anymore. They were hunting Jenna. Her voice had been on every radio wave for days. Her orders had moved troops, saved wounded, called in artillery strikes. She'd become more than a combatant. She'd become a target. A symbol. Captain Marcus Hayes entered the tent, jaw tight. Intel picked up something strange near the north perimeter. Drones spotted movement. Too organized to be scavengers. Jenna stood instantly, ignoring the flash of pain. They're coming again. Marcus didn't need to nod. And this time, they're not after the base. They're after you. 300 hours. Perimeter breach, the enemy came under cover of darkness, black-clad fighters moving with eerie precision. No screaming charges this time. Just the cold silence of professionals with a mission. Within minutes, 2 outer watchtowers were hit. No mortar. Just suppressed rifle fire and swift blades. The insurgents moved like shadows, but one mistake changed everything. They broadcast a chilling message through the loudspeakers they'd hijacked, straight into the base. "We have your men. Give us the woman, or we execute them one by one." A low-resolution feed flashed across every monitor in the command center. 5 American soldiers taken in a nighttime patrol 2 days ago, previously thought KIA, were now kneeling in the dust, bound and blindfolded, guarded by masked insurgents. Jenna stared at the screen. One of them was Private Ellis, just 19. She'd seen him cleaning his boots, joking about candy bars. A week earlier, a countdown began. 5 minutes to comply. The voice on the radio returned. "Bring the ghost woman, the one who fires. Bring her, or they die." The decision. Everyone in the command tent looked at Jenna. "No," Marcus said flatly before she could speak. They'll kill them either way. We don't negotiate. But they're not bluffing, Jenna snapped. They're executing prisoners. That's not leverage, it's blood. We can launch a rescue op, one intel officer said. 30 men? Full blackout assault. But we need a distraction. Jenna turned to the display, tracking heat signatures near the prisoners. She saw a path a risky one through the rubble-strewn northern alley, behind the old depot. And she made a choice. I'll be the distraction. Mick Donovan's return as Jenna grabbed her gear. Someone limped into the tent. Mick Donovan, the wounded contractor. The man who had stood between the base and collapsed more than once already. You're not going out there alone, he said. You can barely stand, she replied. I've still got one good leg and a better shot than most of your trigger-happy privates. Besides, he met her eyes, voice dropping. They're not expecting me. Marcus tried to stop them both. Jenna overruled him. You said it yourself. We can't just wait. We move now. The walk into hell Jenna and Mick made their way. Through the broken northern alley, unseen beneath thermal-shielded tarps. They carried only what they needed, Mick, with his M4 and a sidearm. Jenna with a silencer-fitted pistol, a radio, and a light drone camera hovering silently above them. The insurgents had set up the prisoners in a half-moon clearing, floodlights rigged to burn away any chance of stealth. Jenna walked into the clearing, alone. Every rifle turned toward her. The lead insurgent stepped forward, black scarf. AWK in one hand, remote detonator in the other. You came. She said nothing. He gestured, kneeled beside them. But, before she moved, Mick's voice came crackling through a hidden earpiece. I've got eyes on 2 snipers rooftop and tree line. Taking the shot in 3, 2. 2 PFFT suppressed rounds dropped the spotters in a heartbeat. Panic. Then chaos. Jenna dove, drawing her pistol and firing at the detonator hand. A chunk of it exploded, sending the remote flying into the dirt. Mick stormed into the clearing from behind a rusted vehicle, bullets barking from his rifle as he shouted, Get down! Move! The prisoners flattened themselves, just as the QRF team, Marcus's hand-picked operators, hit the camp from the west. Flashbangs, automatic fire, screams, and silence. It was over in under a minute. Jenna stood in the middle of it all, breathing hard, the taste of copper and adrenaline in her mouth. Mick limped to her side, still standing, somehow still alive. You all right? He asked. She nodded. You? He grinned. Used to be a lot prettier. Aftermath. Back at the base, medics tended to the rescued prisoners. Jenna sat next to Mick in the field hospital again, holding his hand while the stitches went in. You know, he said through gritted teeth, I think this officially makes us even. Jenna squeezed his hand. Not even close. Captain Marcus arrived hours later with 2 folders commendations being submitted to HQ. One for Mick Donovan, citing heroism under fire as a non-combatant. The other for Jenna Ramirez, for valor, leadership, and action above the call of duty. He looked at Jenna and said, You're not just the voice anymore. You're the fire they couldn't put out. Epilogue, 6 months later in a quiet D.C. ceremony, long after the headlines had faded. Jenna stood in dress uniform before a small audience of brass and family members. Medals were pinned. Speeches were made. But the moment she would never forget came afterward. Mick Donovan, clean-shaven, and in a tailored suit, walked up beside her outside the Pentagon steps. You still owe me a steak, he said. Jenna laughed. Only if you promise not to get shot at the restaurant. He nodded toward the sunset. We survived hell. I think we've earned some peace. As they walked away, Jenna glanced back. Once at the marble walls, at the flags, at the memory of the night when the enemy had whispered, Who's firing? Where is she? And she'd answered without words. I standing. by fighting, by surviving. Because sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield isn't the loudest gun or the biggest rank. Sometimes it's just someone who refuses to be silenced.